My name is James Kenley. I serve as the Executive Director of the Vail Symposium, and on behalf of Dale Mosier, our Board Chair, and our entire Board of Directors, many of whom are here this evening, welcome. The Vail Symposium has been providing affordable, diverse, and thought-provoking programming to the Vail Valley since 1971. We are a nonprofit organization, and ticket revenue accounts for less than 15% of our operating budget each year. So donors at all levels allow our programming to happen in our community. I'd like to thank a few specific organizations and individuals that make programs like tonight possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Town of Vail and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Vail Daily, and the Antlers at Vail. The Conversations on Controversial Issues with Clay Jenkinson series is generously underwritten by Alpine Bank, Nancy and Stephen Dowdle, Carol and Pete Feistman, Lainey and Merv Lappin, Jeannie and Dale Mosier, and Mary Pat and Keith Rapp. Each of these programs has a volunteer researcher that does an enormous amount of work. And for tonight's program, Christine Moore receives our gratitude. Would you please give everyone a round of applause?
So, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Excellent. We're glad you're here. At 3 o'clock, I was told that you were all weenies and you wouldn't be coming at all. And so you're the heroes who made it through. What a winter you're having here. Wonderful. This handout in the back has some information about my work and if you want to contact me for any reason. But it also has a reading list of books about the culture wars. And so if you're interested in following up, there's a whole series of them on the table in the back, and the recommended reading would be there. So we're going to have a great evening. We have two spectacular guests. I'll introduce them here in just a couple of minutes. I want to say a few words first. I'm a North Dakotan, so I'm delighted to be here again. I love coming to Vail. I was at the University of Colorado at Boulder for 4 years, and so I spent a lot of time wandering around this great state. And when I think of the idea, if there were only one state, what would it have to be? I'm sorry to say I wouldn't nominate North Dakota. But I do love North Dakota, and I have a new book about it. But I would say Montana, Colorado, Utah are the states that I think are, if there were only one state, it would have to be, because of just the sheer sublimity. And you get to live in one of the most spectacular places on earth, and I know you don't take it for granted. I want to do a little quiz before we start, just to get a show of hands. Don't be shy. I have just 4 questions. So, how many of you, at some point in the last 15 years, have been humiliated or had your feelings hurt by political correctness? Raise your hand. Just look around, and so it's not everyone. How many of you think that there is a crisis in higher education in America? Okay, a huge number. Interesting. How many of you consider yourself woke? Oh, no, we're not going there. And how many of your children or grandchildren consider you woke? Not many. You know, I've got a daughter who, she's like a woke violation machine. And she's a moderate. Okay, how many of you, if you had to, at Rotary or adult Bible class, could define critical race theory? I think you're optimists, actually, but that's fine. Well, we see, I think our guests have seen that there's some concern about universities in America, and I certainly feel it. I want to just show a few preliminary slides, and then I'll bring up our guests. So our theme is, what is cancel culture? And what are the cultural wars on campus? There's a definition by the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat that I thought you might want to take a look at. He says, Cancellation, cancel culture is cancellation properly understood refers to an attack on someone's employment and reputation by a determined collective of critics based on an opinion or an action that is alleged to be disgraceful and disqualifying. So that's, I think, an imperfect definition, but it's a good start. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is Alan Dershowitz. You've all heard of him. He's had a long, long distinguished career as an advocate of freedom of speech. His reputation has been a little bit problematized by his spirited defense of President Trump in the last 4 or 5 years, but he's still one of America's most focused advocates of freedom of expression. And he says, freedom of speech in America is facing the greatest threats since the Alien and Sedition laws of 1798, which unconstitutionally punished, quote, false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the United States. And this happened during Jefferson's life. This was during the quasi-war with France. And the Congress of the United States passed naturalization laws, the Alien laws, and the Sedition law, and made it a crime to criticize the government of the United States. And a number of people went to prison over it. One of the first things that Thomas Jefferson did when he became the third president was to pardon all of the people who were still in prison, and he had their fines remitted. Dershowitz also says, freedom of expression should be protected, not because, this is really important, freedom of expression should be protected not because the marketplace of ideas assures that the good will drive out the bad, but despite the reality that the bad will sometimes prevail. So the Enlightenment ideal is that good ideas will drive out the bad, science will win in a fair fight over superstition, good sense will prevail in a fair argument over nonsense. That's the ideal, the free marketplace of ideas. And Dershowitz is saying, well, doesn't quite work that way every time. Freedom of expression should be protected not because the marketplace of ideas assures that the good will drive out the bad, but despite the reality that the bad will sometimes prevail. So we need to continue to embrace the ideal even when it doesn't always prevail in the marketplace. I think that's particularly important. So next slide, please. I had the good fortune to go to the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and I loved it. And if I could start over, I would go back to it. The whole course of my life was changed by an extraordinarily gifted professor named Thomas Clayton, who is still there, one of the 20 Regents professors of English. This is Northrop Auditorium, which is sort of the centerpiece of the campus. It's a classical Midwestern campus with a huge lawn, and this is the performance auditorium. And you can't see it on this slide, but if you show the next one, James, this is what it says. Founded in the faith that men are ennobled by understanding, dedicated to the advancement of learning and the search for truth, devoted to the instruction of youth and the welfare of the state. That inspired me. I would turn in a paper, realize how pathetic I was, kick myself back across campus, sit under this facade, and drink that in. I don't think this could be written today by any standard university in this country, certainly not at the University of Minnesota. Founded in the faith that men, of course, that wouldn't be an adequate term, founded in the faith that men are ennobled by understanding. That's a strong term, ennobled. Dedicated to the advancement of learning, certainly. And the search for truth. You know, the postmodernists say there is no truth. The truth is a construct. It's behind words like truth, justice, beauty, is really just power. And these are a smokescreen put up by people of power to protect their oppression of minorities and so on. And so I doubt that the University of Minnesota would dare say that they are really any longer engaged in the search for truth. And then finally, devoted to the instruction of youth, of course, and the welfare of the state. I don't think, even though these are universities that are funded by taxpayers, or at least in part, I doubt that they would now dare to say that they are engaged in the welfare of the state. This just gives me a sense of how far we have come. If you just go back one more time to that facade, that was then, the 1930s. This is now. So now up to the next one. This is Denis Diderot, one of the greatest of the Enlightenment philosophers. He is the founder of the great French encyclopedia. Jefferson owned a full set of the 43 volumes. He bought a set for James Madison. He was proselytizing, he was almost running subscriptions for the encyclopedia. And Diderot most famously said, and I didn't put it on the slide, but he said that we will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. So political correctness, righteousness is not a modern invention. Well, that's pretty strong, I think. But this is something much better that he said. All things must be examined, debated, investigated without exception and without regard for anyone's feelings. And that really is essentially could be used as the mission statement of the Enlightenment. So then let's go to the man himself, my man Thomas Jefferson. This is the fabulous, famous Houdon bust of Jefferson. Houdon presents a real human being who lived between 1743 and 1826 as this Enlightenment hero. Look at the serenity, the intensity, the rationality, the classical symmetry of this portrait. Yes, Jefferson was those things, but he was many other things too, of course, including a slaveholder who owned more than 600 human beings and bought and sold them throughout his life. This is Jefferson as his best self. And Jefferson believed that we can be our best selves, that we have complicated selves, but if we work really hard at it and educate ourselves and stay close to nature, that we can often rise to be our best selves. And here he's portrayed that way. This is from his second greatest hit, the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and then the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. And the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty has one of the finest preambles of any piece of legislation in world history. And this is just a little of what it says. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishment or burthens, or by civil incapacitations, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness. God intended the mind to be utterly free and uncoercible. And next slide. Also from the same preamble to the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, which passed into law in 1786. This is the painting of Jefferson by the Peels, Charles Wilson Peel, 1805. That truth is great. This is that very statement of the free marketplace of ideas. The truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition, human interference, human meddling, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate. Her natural weapons are free argument and debate. Errors cease to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. And then just one more by Jefferson, late in life. This is the fabulous rotunda on the lawn of UVA. It's a replica in miniature of the Pantheon at Rome, which Jefferson regarded as a perfect structure. He adjusted it a little. It's been restored now with its copper roof, and it's just sublime. That statue of Jefferson may not survive. We'll see. But this is a temple of reason, a temple of the Enlightenment at the heart of Mr. Jefferson's greatest hit in some ways, the university. And here's what he said about it. This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind, for here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor afraid to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it. And I'd say, and I'll ask my guests here in a moment, I think that's essentially the mission statement of American universities once they began to secularize in the early to mid-19th century. And whether that continues to be the mission statement of our greatest universities, I think, is an open question. So before I bring them up, let's do one more thing. I had the great good fortune to interview Mark Edmondson, who teaches the humanities at UVA. He's written a wonderful book called The Heart of the Humanities, which is on the reading list. And I asked him about the particular issue of UVA and Thomas Jefferson, because students, if you can imagine it, and I suppose we all can, students enroll, get into UVA, which is not at all easy to do, and some of them after a year or so say, I don't like this place because it was built by slave labor. The bricks were baked by enslaved people, the timbers were cut, the grounds were leveled, all the landscape people and the janitors and the cooks and so on were enslaved people, and they say, how dare Mr. Jefferson have done this? To which I sort of want to say, you might have thought of that before you applied. You know, it's not a mystery, this, but it sort of tells us where. But here's Mark Edmondson talking about the predicament that Jefferson himself is in.
There was a movement to, expunge Jefferson from the university, right? It was a small movement, and most students haven't the least interest in doing that. But if it comes from student council, which it may have done, if it comes from the student newspaper, which it may have done, it's going to get some traction. And Ryan just said, no, that's not happening. UVA is Jefferson, Jefferson is UVA. Now, we will, by his statue, we'll put a plaque that puts him in context. I haven't seen the contextual plaque yet. But Jefferson is our mainstay. What I have always, not always, but in the last 20 years, have suggested is that everybody has to take a 2-credit course, 1-credit course on Thomas Jefferson, right? And you learn not only about Jefferson's flaws, which are not insignificant, but also about the amazing achievement of the man. Do you know? It's not just that we might not be sitting here at the University of Virginia if we're not for Jefferson, but we might not be sitting here in the United States of America if not for Jefferson. The values that Jefferson endorses in the Declaration of Independence not only have given us tremendous opportunities to flourish, but they're heard around the world. The people who are rebelling in China, the young women who are rebelling in Iran, if they're not quoting Jefferson directly, they're quoting him indirectly.
Okay, so what he said there was maybe they won't pull the statue down, but they'll put up a plaque saying he did some really bad things. We're here, but Jefferson's really responsible for some very bad things. And of course, that's true. But you sort of think, well, if ever there were a sanctuary where Jefferson should have a chance to be unmolested, you would think that might be it. And the question we might have is a plaque enough? Because the people who feel very strongly about this want to take him down altogether. So, it's just a small example of where we are in 2023. And the question is, will this grow more virulent and widespread? Will it moderate over time? Is this a wave that will pass? We just don't know. That's why we brought such extraordinary guests tonight. So let me introduce first Robert Shibley. Come on up, Robert. Robert, as you see, is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, where he's worked for 19 years. He's an undergraduate from Duke and has a law degree from Duke. He has written very widely, including for the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Washington Post, and Time. He's been on major media in all sorts of directions, but in particular, Tucker Carlson, Fox and Friends, Lou Dobbs, etc. Welcome to Vail, Colorado.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great to be here.
Let me just say, he did not bring a coat.
I did. It was a North Carolina rated coat. Yeah.
A thin little jacket. And now Keith Whittington, come on up, Keith. Keith is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. Princeton, who is still in the NCAA tournament.
Unlike Duke.
Talk about shocking events in higher ed. He's the chair of the Academic Freedom Alliance. He's been a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's the author of a book that I highly recommend to all of you. It's on my list, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. He's been a visiting professor at Harvard, Law, Georgetown University Law Center, and elsewhere. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is one of the most prestigious organizations in the New World. And he has served on a presidential commission on the future of the Supreme Court. So tempted I am to just talk about the Supreme Court. We will not. So gentlemen, you've seen these first few slides. Robert, where are you in this? Are you in agreement with the idea that the Enlightenment ideals are the ideals?
I think they are. I think they are the only ideals that make sense as the foundational ideals for a university in what I guess the Enlightenment ushered in the modern, right? And so in the modern university setting, I think that that search for truth, the idea that you're going to allow anything to be investigated, and that you are going to be engaged in the enterprise of trying to find out what the truth of whatever proposition it is, I think that's the only practical thing that we can really rely on as a mission statement for that kind of university. That's not to say that religious universities can't exist or can't be part of that, or universities of other mission bases. But
and in fact, most universities historically began as religious
that's
institutions.
right. Yeah, certainly out in the East Coast, particularly, and Princeton and Harvard, that intended to train ministers once upon a time. And so it doesn't mean that they can't have a share in that, but the more we get away from that, the more we decide what the truth is ahead of time, and we sort of are just trying to backfill, to bolster our own beliefs rather than have a sincere and honest conversation with the recognition that maybe we're wrong. That possibility, even if it's very, very unlikely, but the possibility that we're wrong, or as Mill said, even if even ideas that are wrong are usually not 100% wrong, and ideas that are right are usually not 100% right. John Stuart Mill pointed out that allowing those to be challenged helps you get further. It helps the sifting and winnowing that gets you further towards the truth of the matter.
Did you all hear, Robert? Good. So just one more question, then I'll turn to Keith. So that statement by Jefferson, illimitable truth, not afraid to follow truth wherever it leads. Yeah. And that's a very strong statement, wherever it leads. Can you imagine universities today adopting that as their principle?
I think it would be very tough. And I think it's very good as hortatory language, and I think it's important, but I think there's a temptation today to let the exception to that kind of thing drive the rule. And for instance, you talk about the enthusiasm that was around the early 1900s for eugenics, right? And for the kind of brutal experimentation that is required. There are now debates over cloning and what you should do with human cells and things like that. So you can take that, and I think Jefferson and the Enlightenment, the humanitarians who really drove the Enlightenment, would have understood, okay, there are some limits. There are the limits of sort of this common morality, which is less common now, and then we have less in common to do that. But for that reason, I think it would be tough for a university to really take the hard form of committing to that now, because the objections to each of the exceptions are being allowed to subsume this overall rule. I hope that wasn't too esoteric an answer to your question.
So, by the way, you're going to have plenty of time for questions, so we're leaving that. But Professor Whittington, Keith, what Jefferson said is really noble, of course. And it sort of, we all feel, especially if you're professors, you feel sort of drawn into that. And it's an inspiring thing for him to have said. Some of the postmodernists would say, it doesn't count because he was a slaveholder and an exploiter of other human beings. And so how can we, this discredits even a great thing like that. It just has to be discredited now. And some would, the sort of Foucaultians would say, it's meaningless anyway. Truth, justice, these are just power constructs by a self-satisfied white elite in the New World. I take it you don't agree with that.
No, I tend not to agree with that. I still believe, and I'm somewhat optimistic, that there is still a significant constituency that believes that at the very heart of what universities are all about is that effort to try to advance human knowledge. Try to work on the boundaries and the frontiers of what we know, trying to push that forward, try to convey that information to others, try to share it not only with students, but with the world more generally. And if that's not the mission of the university, I really don't understand what we're doing here with those kinds of institutions. I think there are lots of people, though, both inside and outside of universities, that increasingly are uncomfortable with that mission, that to some degree they want to supplement that mission with others that are sometimes hard to attach to it without undercutting that core set of concerns. But there are those, I think, who would say we ought to push that aside. That's not really what universities are for, therefore something else, in part because there is a deep skepticism for some in the very idea of ideas competing, the very idea of trying to search for truth. They do think of the argumentation as primarily power conflicts. And if that's fundamentally what you think you do when you argue and talk about ideas, is primarily what you're doing is asserting power, then it's hard to sustain anything that looks like a university under those circumstances. But there are certainly people who've drunk that Kool-Aid and believe that's how we ought to be thinking about these things.
You saw that, that model from the University of Minnesota, which dovetails with Jefferson in many ways, although more committed to the welfare of the state maybe. I think I could imagine, I don't mean to caricature, a university today saying, dedicated to the pursuit of social justice, and truth is a tool, but it's not the final tool, and that our duty is to deconstruct the core concepts of our civilization to make sure that they are really serving everyone equally. Something like that, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen universities, in fact, do that. I mean, so some universities are, in fact, rewriting their mission statements, or they're adding supplemental documents about what the values of the university are, for example. And strikingly, a lot of those new mission statements and value statements that have been adopted over the last 20 years or so often do not include anything about advancing knowledge, searching for truth, educating students. It's kind of remarkable when you look at those documents as to how universities are characterizing themselves in their core mission, which is all about instead trying to support economic growth, trying to build a community, bring in students who will feel like they belong in the institution, sometimes explicitly committing to social justice in some form. And at the end of the day, it's just a radically different conception of what you think universities are doing, and it doesn't make a lot of sense of what still a lot of features of universities are. What are we doing in classes? What are we doing with our research if this is our vision of universities? And one of the concerns I would have relating to what you just said, that social justice or truth might be a means to get to social justice. One of my real concerns about this is that not only is social justice the end, but it's the end that can ultimately trump the search for truth, right? So there's a lot of people, I think, inside universities at this point who want to argue if ideas are true, but they undermine our political agenda relative to social justice, it'd be better if we didn't have those ideas and we didn't explore them, we didn't reveal the fact they might be true. They'd rather sit in error in order to salvage what they think is more important, which is a set of political goals, which I just think is terribly disturbing.
So say that, you got to say that again.
Yeah.
Slow it down, because that's so important. That you're saying that some universities would subordinate the search for truth and say that it's fine as far as it goes, but it can't be allowed to get in. There are some things we might not want to pursue if they lead to outcomes that are not square with current ideals of our culture.
Yes, I mean, we're certainly seeing that in universities, but we're also seeing it in the scholarly apparatus that surrounds universities. So we now see major journals in the natural sciences that have said, we're not going to accept certain scholarly papers if they have the potential to do harm in various ways to certain communities that we care about, or that they're going to undermine certain political goals in general. That the goal of the scientific journals is not simply to discover the truth as best we can, but instead the goal of the scientific journals is to discover the truth as best we can within some confines. Then those confines determined by a set of normative goals. You take some things off the table if they're inconsistent with the normative values that we're trying to advance. And so it just sacrifices the kind of argument that these Enlightenment thinkers would have said, which is, we have to question everything. We have to be willing to say everything's on the table.
No matter where it leads.
No matter where it leads. And there's plenty of people, I think, in universities at this point and around universities who say that's just not true. we're not willing to pursue truth, we're not willing to pursue arguments wherever it might lead, because it might lead to bad places I don't like. And so we need to prevent that from happening.
So James, can we just toggle through the subjects we're hoping to get to here? How widespread is this? The threat to education. The idea of a university, we've kind of covered that to a certain degree already. The chilling effect, which I really want to spend some time on, because you'll see we're going to show some clips of incidents where this becomes it goes viral, it's horrific. We can all agree that it shouldn't have happened. We can mostly agree that it shouldn't have happened. The question is, are they representative or are they more extreme? But what's the chilling effect on other discourse at a less viral and controversial nature? Where's this headed? And then finally, backlash. So with your permission, I would like to show this first clip. Josh Blackman is a member of the Federalist Society. He's a conservative legal theorist. He's given lectures all over the country. He's controversial. He gave a lecture in 2018, or tried to, at City University of New York at Queens in their law school. And he was heavily disrupted, almost prevented from giving his talk, shouted down every time he opened his mouth. Eventually, the protesters withdrew a little bit, and he was able, after a fashion, to finish his talk. And here's what he says about it.
When the time came, I got in the elevator, I went down, and I walked through the hallway, and there were dozens of students yelling at me, screaming at me, holding up signs, calling me a fascist, a Nazi, a racist, a sexist, every name in the book. It was bothersome, but I think they still had the right to speak at me in the hallway. I don't have some sort of a God-given right to walk unaccosted into a classroom. If they want to yell at me, they can do that. When I walked into the classroom, the protesters streamed in, and they filled the entire perimeter of the room with protesters standing at every corner of the room. Some were standing right behind me at the podium, maybe a few inches behind me, and they were holding up signs. I never really felt threatened. They were close enough, but I didn't think they were there to commit any sort of actual physical violence. But their intent was different. They were there to make it impossible for me to speak. In time, I started talking to them and asked them what they thought, and I realized they didn't even know who I was. They had no idea. They had read some talking points about me that were on flyers that were really not accurate. And after about 10 minutes or so, they said, okay, forget this, we're going to leave. And the protesters left. They were frustrated because I didn't give them what they wanted.
So what strikes me, there's a little hard to follow that because of the audio quality, but this is an interview we conducted. Interestingly, he said that, and we take his word for this because we weren't there, but he said that most of the protesters didn't actually know what it was that they were protesting, that they had been urged to protest, told that he was a schnook, that he was a dangerous man, and that he shouldn't be allowed to speak, and he believed that most of them could not have explained, even in a very summary view, what his point was, what his argument was going to be. If that's the case, that's pretty chilling. So, Robert, do you think that's true, that these protests they're sort of almost in a certain sense mob events that are not clearly articulated?
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, I believe that the organizers often have a fairly clear idea of what they're trying to oppose and why they want that person not to be able to speak, but they definitely do take on a life of their own. They become sort of an event. It's exciting. I went to law school, as did you. It's not always real exciting to go see legal speakers or go to class. It is, I wasn't part of this when I was in law school, but it sounds much more interesting. It gives the people participating this idea that they are somehow making a difference, and they are making a difference, but it's generally speaking, it's probably not a positive difference when the idea is, and I think you had the definition Ross Douthat had of cancel culture. Something I think that is important to think about is the intent. I think an important component a lot of times in these cancellations, whether they're in person or online, is that the intent isn't to convince either the target or people, the intent is just to silence them. You're not trying to win an argument, you're trying to make the argument impossible. And that's really dangerous in situations like law school, dangerous not just necessarily in an intellectual sense, although it certainly is, but also keeping lawyers ignorant about, future lawyers ignorant and current lawyers ignorant about developments in the law has real world ramifications for the people who need those people to be their attorneys. A good example was a few years back, Jeannie Suk Gerson, who's a professor at Harvard Law School, said that some of her colleagues had quit in criminal law, had stopped teaching law about rape because students were saying that it was triggering, that they had had those experiences, and particularly if you are an untenured professor or somebody who doesn't feel very secure, they had made the decision that is, it's a logical decision, but it's nevertheless a bad decision, that they were just going to leave it out completely of the curriculum.
Just don't touch it.
They were just, so if you took criminal law, I mean, that's a fairly important crime to know about, and Harvard was sending people out into the world ignorant of that because
Harvard
University, right?
Harvard University Law School.
And there are people who will go poorly prosecuted and poorly defended, or more poorly than they would have been otherwise because of that decision. So there are real world ramifications to the kind of thing that is happening and that Josh Blackman described there. Because it is, I mean, while it sounded like he walked through a gauntlet. I mean, can you imagine you're going to your speech and this is what you see on the way in, and then, I mean, people understand this, and they are not eager to accept speaking
under such conditions.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what's going to happen, as a similar thing happened at Stanford recently with a federal judge, it's going to be very difficult to get people to come and speak, and so that chilling effect is very real.
So just three quick things about that. So Josh Blackman will appear later in one final clip if we have time. He did say that this is the only time that's really happened, that he's given many, many speeches before and after where there might have been some protest, but there wasn't any significant disruption. Yeah. He said that he wasn't wasn't frightened by people standing behind him. I would have been. You don't know whether they're going to clobber you or shove you or make obscene gestures, but just having someone behind you when you're trying to speak is very, very, very disconcerting, and you lose your concentration. And what he didn't put in this clip, because just for editing for time, he said that when he came in, the administrator at CUNY, New York, said, "Do you have an exit strategy?" And think of that as you're welcome to our university. Do you have a safe way of getting out of here if necessary? Do you have an exit strategy? That's rough. So I want to show one from Penn State here in a second. This is a little different. There was a riot. This is not just people shouting. This is a riot, and it involved two of the Proud Boys who were invited by an undergraduate organization to come speak. You can imagine how that is volatile. And we're just going to show a tiny clip of it to give you a sense of how bad this can get.
Penn State canceled a planned comedy event, purported comedy event, I don't think it would have been very funny, on Monday that was set to be co-hosted by the founder of the far-right Proud Boys group, Gavin McInnes, after a demonstration against the speakers turned violent. According to the New York Times, police stood back as someone, allegedly a right-wing figure, reportedly pulled out a canister of mace and pointed it at a crowd of anti-Proud Boy protesters and sprayed some of them. Let's watch.
I think Tucker Carlson said they were just getting to water at the water fountain. So I didn't know whether this was January 6th or whether this was Penn State, but this happened, okay, and we're only showing a teeny clip of this. So go to the next slide, please, James. This is what the president of Penn State said it, and Keith, I want you to respond to this first because I know you're going to kind of pop off on this, Robert. The event, this is the president of the university one day later in a memo to the university and the press. The event was to feature Gavin McInnes and Alex Stein, who are provocateurs known for their abhorrent views and rhetoric From the start, Penn State's administration, before they came, Penn State's administration firmly denounced the two speakers. However, they were invited to speak on campus by a registered student organization, nothing we can do about that. And as an institution of higher education, we support the fundamental constitutional right of speech, and free expression of all members of our community. It is precisely because of this unwavering commitment to free speech that provocative individuals target our campus to deliver speeches. I am so proud of our students who organized an alternative event, it was well across campus, a rival event, to register their disapproval of these speakers and their disavowal of their hateful messages. President Neely Vendiputi. Keith, that doesn't sound like the free marketplace of ideas. That sounds like a pretty serious prejudicing of any way to evaluate this incident.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. I tend to think in general that university presidents should refrain from making that kind of commentary about any speaker that comes to campus. There's often pressure on university presidents to not only issue statements about speakers coming to campus, but lots of world events more generally. And I think the cleanest way for presidents to handle that is simply to refuse to issue statements of that sort in general. It makes sense to state the policy of the university, for example, but doesn't make sense to single out some speakers in order to denounce them. Partially, I think when university presidents do that, it can encourage these kinds of mob actions. I think we saw that with Stanford Law School, for example, where they were precisely doing the same thing there. They had associate deans who were sending out messages effectively encouraging a disruptive protest by denouncing the speaker before
Pre-denouncing.
Speaker being a judge in that case before the judge came. So you have the possibility of creating these kinds of problems, but you also are sending a signal that's very selective as to when presidents do that, and you're sending signals then to members of the campus community say, we don't really value you and your activities and the speech and ideas you're concerned about. We regard those as unfortunate features of the university that we must tolerate, but not something that really we'd prefer to have on our campus. And presidents really just shouldn't be in that business.
James, could you go back to the slide for just a minute? So Robert, if she had just said, we support the fundamental constitutional right of free speech and free expression of all members of our community. Sometimes they have views that are hard to understand or hard to accept. That would be another statement of the Enlightenment ideal.
Yeah.
She didn't leave it at that. There's a certain CYA, cover your back kind in this, this is partly so that she can say to the people who are outraged by the Proud Boys, look, we denounced them, our hands were tied, we had to let them speak. It seems to me that this is a really maybe cowardly statement.
It is, but it's also a very typical kind of statement that we see from university presidents, and it's something that it sets an expectation that there are some views that are so unacceptable that you shouldn't even be allowed to consider them on campus, which undermines completely the First Amendment right. It's almost like scapegoating the First Amendment, saying, oh, well, we had to allow these people to speak. The true bad guy here is the law and the Constitution. I'm the good guy. I agree with all of you, presumably, that these are bad folks. And that's less risky when it's a group like the Proud Boys, which is generally considered to be pretty fringe. It's less risky, but that doesn't make it more right. Because students ought to be allowed to confront these kinds of ideas in an intellectual way. One thing, you all probably remember Richard Spencer, the alt-right, semi-Nazi kind of whatever you want to call him, leader who was going around. He had a similar campus tour that was going on, and I was really struck by a video of him that was posted by one of his fans, believe it or not, although it was strange, of him at Texas A&M. And he was actually doing a Q&A at Texas A&M. He was allowed to rent the place. He wasn't invited, but they had a policy. And the students were asking him questions, and professors were asking him questions that he did not have a good answer for. In fact, part of his whole shtick was saying that black people ought to be sent back to Africa or something, and somebody asked him, what about, a black student got up and said, I was born here, I don't know any African languages, I don't know all this, and he said, I guess you can stay. Well, that's, if you think about that, like the opportunity to have that Q&A got Richard Spencer, of all people, to back away from one of the main planks of his platform. I mean, the power of actually being able to confront bad ideas is huge. And so when you cut that off, that's the kind of disservice that you're doing. And it also has the advantage of, whoever knew truth to be, I think Mill put it this way, but the same thing Jefferson said, whoever knew truth to be put in the worst in a fair encounter.
Right. Milton too.
You actually get to see that in action if you allow these kinds of interactions to happen in a way, in a place. My boss, Greg Lukianoff at FIRE, would say, and I think it's true, universities should be the ultimate free speech zones in a free society. If anything, it should be freer to say something.
Right.
People should say, all right, I understand we're at a university. Maybe we're going to have controversial discussions the way that we're not going to out in front of my yard. I don't really want Richard Spencer out there or whatever, right? But you would expect to run into odd characters at a university, at least traditionally, and be able to engage with them. And that is a real loss for the students there, and I think for our society too.
And remember, in 1952, 3, 4, 5, leftists,
that's right,
people who were perceived to be leftists, were refused chances to speak.
There
is
North Carolina had a speaker ban, they called it, on communist speakers, and there's actually, if you're outside the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, there's a plaque sitting in the sidewalk, because what would happen is the students would invite the speakers. They weren't allowed to come on, but on campus. So right off the sidewalk, like there was a place where the left, the Marxist speakers would come, and the students would come and listen to them, but they weren't actually technically stepping foot on campus. And that's memorialized in one of these plaques. It's like, this is the kind of thing that was happening, and it's very disturbing to see that lesson not be remembered or learned by today's folks who are, engaged in the same kind of enterprise.
Robert Oppenheimer was refused a chance to speak at Harvard after his fall in 1954 because he was perceived to be a security threat and possibly a communist. He was neither. Mm-hmm. And the person who did that was Archie Roosevelt, the son of Theodore Roosevelt, who led the Board of Regents attack on the possibility of J. Robert Oppenheimer speaking at Harvard. So it goes both ways. It depends on the time. And that's why the standard needs to be so high. Now, the Proud Boys, it's hard to imagine their comedy show, frankly, unless it's all a comedy show. But so I would kind of like to see it. And one thing that could be done is the students could have come and all turned their back on him, on them, and just protested in that kind of very powerful, silent way. Keith, we can all imagine someone that you don't want to speak on a college campus. Sure. But the standard has to be almost anything is permissible, because if not there, where do people have the tools to respond and open debate? And don't you want the students at Princeton and Berkeley and the University of North Dakota to encounter abhorrent ideas so that they learn how to encounter them with something like a mature response?
I think that's right, although I tend to sort of think that there's two kinds of questions we ought to be asking, right? So one is, what kinds of speakers or speech can we prohibit from the university campus, not allow it to take place? And there, I'm pretty much an absolutist and really willing to say.
So anyone goes?
Anything goes, anyone can come to campus and talk about things. There's a second question, though, and some of these cases of invited speakers raise, of who would you like to bring to campus, because who do you think you're going to learn from?
Right.
And so I think it'd be a terrible waste of time for students to say, it'd be great to bring Richard Spencer to campus because that's the guy we want to hear from. It's just not very productive or useful, and for the most part, I would encourage the students who have a lot of power in current universities. We give a lot of space for students to invite people to campuses. And so a lot of these controversial outside speakers are a function of student groups inviting people to campuses. We give them that capacity so they can hear from people they want to hear from, but we also should be thinking seriously about who can we bring to campus that would actually be interesting, that we'd learn from, that's not just poking somebody in the eye in order to get people riled up. Students don't always think that way. They certainly have different views than I do about who's interesting. to hear from. And so, they'll make mistakes, they'll make different judgments, but they ought to be taking that responsibility seriously when they think about who comes to campus. Part of what's interesting about the Richard Spencer campus tour is, for the most part, he was not being invited to a lot of those campuses. He was going to state universities and renting out auditoriums that were freely available to the public. So a lot of these state universities had a policy: anyone can come rent the stadium, the auditorium, and then Richard Spencer showed up and rented it, and most of those universities stuck to their policy and said anyone can rent it. And one kind of response was no one came. And so once that happened, he eventually stopped his tour. He went away.
So the market responded.
Right, the market responded. Partly, I think people successfully convinced students, say, don't go have big protests. Don't give him what he wants, which is more attention. Just don't go. And so he was speaking to a lot of empty auditoriums for a while, and then he just went home. So, I think that's often a very successful strategy with those kind of people.
But presumably Penn State is a largely left-of-center student body and faculty, and so the student organization that invited the Proud Boys in part might have wanted just to get the libs, just to do a provocative thing and say, we'll show you what free speech looks like.
And the more you make it clear that that's unacceptable, the more you're prompting people to try to stick it in. I mean, it's an arms race. Nobody likes to be told they're not allowed to. I mean, we think of it as sort of a juvenile thing, but nobody wants. I mean, when you hear a book is banned, the immediate thought in most people's minds is like, what's it say in this book that's so important that it needs to be banned? Right? Like, what are they trying to hide? And the answer is often something. Like, it's a good response, because if people are that amped up about a book, frequently it's because they really don't want you to know what's in it. And so I think it's a similar, maybe more juvenile thing that's happening on college campuses. With owning the libs or owning the cons or whatever it is you want to call it. But it's also, we should have expected that when we started to really mother and father, parent, these students in a way that treats them like they're kids rather than 18-year-olds who, well, they used to be able to smoke, but, who can be called to fight in a war and die, and they can vote. They have to be full members of our society. We expect them to participate in our polity, and yet, we're telling them like, well, you can't hear from that guy. Those two things don't register with each other.
So when I hear a banned book, I get on Amazon right away just to buy it, because I want to support the idea of freedom of expression. But I also, as you said, sort of want to know what's so dangerous in the covers of that book. Let's move on. We've got to keep moving. We want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. I want to show this clip. You've probably already all heard of this one. This is the thing that happened at Hamline University in the Twin Cities. Hamline is a small liberal arts university and a law school in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A professor there of art, who was an adjunct professor, not tenured, was teaching an art history course and decided that she, in good conscience, needed to show an image of the Prophet Muhammad from the 14th century. And she knew that this would be potentially controversial. So she put it in her syllabus that this is happening and you should know that. Maybe you don't want to sign up for this course, or if you do sign up for this course, you might not want to come during that section. Then she offered trigger warnings repeatedly before that week. And on the day in question, she said, before she showed this image, if anyone's uncomfortable and just didn't come today, but you feel uncomfortable now, you can leave. There'll be no shame. This is perfectly legitimate. We'll find alternative work for you to do. And then she showed an image of the Prophet Muhammad of the 14th century, and she was canceled. Watch.
An adjunct professor at Hamline University in Minnesota says she lost her job for showing a painting that depicted the Prophet Muhammad. Many modern Muslim clerics believe that visual representations of the Prophet Muhammad should not be shown, but such a instruction is not explicitly stated in the Quran. Professor Erica Lopez Prater says she warned her students that she was going to show an image of a famous 14th century painting that depicted Muhammad, this in her art history class. She said any students with concerns should come to her directly. After showing her class the painting, which depicts a winged and crowned angel Gabriel pointing at the Prophet Muhammad, a student complained, and the professor subsequently was not asked to return to teach next year. This has sparked debate over free speech and religious freedom. We want to bring in right now Omid Safi. He's an Iranian-American who teaches Asian and Middle Eastern studies at Duke University. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor Safi. So Hamline's president in an email to students and faculty that was shared with CNN. Says, quote, "We believe in academic freedom, but it should not and cannot be used to be used to excuse away behavior that harms others," unquote. How do you see this?
Thank you so much for having me on. I think the words of the Hamlin president are more than a little unfortunate, because it pits it as an issue of freedom of speech versus the sensitivities of Muslim students. The fact of the matter is that these kinds of images have been an important part of the Islamic tradition. They are a sacred icon tradition, if you want to use that word, and they have existed in both the Sunni and the Shia tradition going back almost 1,000 years. So I think there's a big difference between the kind of offensive images like the ones that we saw in Charlie Hebdo and iconic devotional works of art which have been produced by Muslim artists for consumption of Muslims, with the specific goal of drawing the audience closer to the Prophet and closer to God.
I think it's interesting that CNN did not show the image. They're not idiots. They did not show the image. And you almost, I've gone through many of the newsreels over this, and it's not being shown. There's just a sense that that's a volatility that is really best left alone. So let's go to the chilling effect here. I want to do one more thing first. I want to go to slide 33, if you have it, James. This is the president of Hamlin. Now, I should say that in the Twin Cities, there's a relatively large Islamic population, and this university has reached out in a big way to invite young Muslims to attend, and so it's made that part of its market approach. And here's what the president, Fainees S. Miller, said, and I think Jefferson is now rolling in his grave: "Respect for the observant Muslim students in that classroom should have superseded academic freedom." Say what?
Yeah.
Respect for the observant Muslim students in that classroom should have superseded academic freedom. So my question for you, Robert, is, this is obviously a strong statement.
Yeah.
How common, is this a one-off, or would you see this in a whole range of places?
Well, we see it more often with controversies that have to do with Islam, I think, in this country at least. It's very easy to make comparisons to, how people might have felt about, depictions of Jesus or God, which are in some Christian traditions not supposed to be made, and how we would feel. I mean, I think a big part of it is that because it's Islam and because it is, people don't really understand Islam. It's still sort of considered kind of to be the other. We kind of feel like we have a handle of Christianity and even Judaism to a certain extent en masse in the United States. But so we feel like, well, we know enough. We feel like we know enough about those traditions to say we don't really think that over. We don't think that is the calculus you would make. It's harder to do with people who are of the Islamic faith. And so we do see it more with such students at various universities. There's been, at Michigan, there was a controversy a few years ago about setting aside certain bathrooms, certain areas only for Muslim students either to pray or to wash their feet. And these would be places that were religiously segregated, which, is unlawful to do when it's a state university, but nevertheless was being considered, and it, in a way that it would never be considered for Christians or Jews, generally speaking. So I think everybody, this is one of those where you can really apply, I guess, the golden rule in a very simple way. If you change the parties here, how would you feel about saying, well, we've got to, watch out for the evangelical Christian sensibilities, and we're not going to investigate or engage in this kind of enterprise. But it does seem, even to me, who's worked in this area for many years, I sort of understand why she said that in a way that I would have a harder time understanding understanding if it was somebody of a more familiar faith. But at the same time, we can't allow that to set forth the agenda, because it is starting to set those things out of bounds, starts to whittle away on what kind of things we can consider. That aspect of art history there might not seem hugely important, but it starts to take these bites out of things, and particularly when you have more volatile cultural issues, you can really see where talking about sensibilities of let's say you want to investigate transgenderism or homosexuality, you want to have classes about that. How do more traditional Muslim believers feel about that? Are we going to allow that to say that we're not even going to investigate that? But that is where you immediately go once you start down this road. And I think that's why the president there was so widely condemned, both on the right and the left, for what she did there. Because it became something that was so obviously a bad idea that everybody agreed on. I think is she resigning, or is she?
No, not yet.
No, she's not, but she is being sued. It's gotten very sticky for her, but she stuck with that for a very long time under a lot of pressure from various groups. It wasn't until she was sued by the professor that she even started to relent on this idea and say, okay, well, maybe academic freedom is more important than I thought.
But, just a couple things. First of all, ask Salman Rushdie.
Yeah.
This can get violent very fast.
Yes, it can.
And when he finally began to relax after decades of the fatwa, he's viciously assaulted at Lake Chautauqua, theoretically one of the most innocent places to speak in America. And now he's blind, and one arm is permanently disabled. He's still Rushdie. He's defiant, and he moves on. But you can imagine the conversations in this president's office. Because if a student in one of my classes, if a fundamentalist Christian student objected to something that I was doing, I'd say, deal with it, right? Because we're a secular culture, and we just deal with it. And I'd be backed probably by my administration. But I'm sure in this office they were thinking, what could happen here?
Yeah.
If we say, deal with it, or even in a very polite way, this is what happens at a university, this could have been a riot, there could have been violence. This professor probably was under a security watch for a period of time. So, Keith, when we talk about Islam at this period, and of course, Islam is not a monolith, of course. There are billions of Muslims in the world, and the spectrum is as wide as any spectrum. But this is kind of a special instance at this moment in Western history.
I think you're being much more charitable to the president than I would be in this case. It's so these are the kinds of cases that the organization that I help run, the Academic Freedom Alliance, works on. Including this one, we wrote a public letter to the university and reached out to the instructor involved in this situation as well. In lots of ways, this is, I think, a very familiar and common kind of situation that occurs in universities all across the country. It is not at all uncommon for students to complain that they've been exposed to something in the classroom that they find objectionable, and they want the instructor punished for it as a consequence. The specifics of this situation are, of course, those details are specific here, but that kind of argument that was being made here are arguments that are being made all across the United States in all kinds of situations. Also, what's interesting and common in this kind of situation is that the president of the Muslim Student Association, Hamlin, was one of the students in the class. She went to the faculty advisor, or actually not a faculty, but the advisor, university advisor to the group, which was their director of the social justice program on campus, who then took it to the vice president of inclusive excellence, who issued the initial public statements. And so there's a bureaucracy that's precisely concerned with saying, if I have a student who's offended for some reason of something happening in the classroom, the priority of those actors within the university is how do I comfort that student and denounce the professor and make this controversy go away from that perspective. The one part of this I think is actually unusual is that the president of the university was explicit about what's happening on campuses and actually justified it. Because what you see most of the time is university presidents don't try to be that explicit. But that's totally what they all think. And given the actual behavior they're engaged
That's their tacit motto.
This is tacitly what they are doing. The practice on university campuses is the case that what this president said explicitly, that's the actual practice that's often taking place. And so I think what's unusual here is simply the fact that she made the subtext text, and people saw what was happening. And then I'm optimistic about the fact that a lot of people saw what was happening and then were revolted by and said, oh, that was a huge mistake. That's not the road we want to go down. And so maybe that will be helpful in the long term, that she's putting directly on the table what the situation is.
So CNN brings in Ahmed Safi from Duke, and he said something very important, which is that in the history of Islam, representations of the prophet have not been offensive until relatively recently, and so some of the people who are protesting are probably not aware of that tradition. If they were, they might be more tolerant or more charitable, and so the ignorance is often a fuel of these protests, right?
It is, but at the same time, he said something that I thought was disappointing, which was saying, well, it's different when it was by a faithful Muslim of the time than when it's a caricature by Charlie Hebdo.
Right.
If you remember what happened in
France
Charlie
and then
Hebdo,
in the Low Countries.
In France, it's their most famous satirical magazine, and they were massacred for depictions of cartoons, basically,
Which
that
was
were
not-
insulting
which was not
and
respectful.
offensive.
It was meant to
It
be
was not
satire.
respectful. It was meant to be satirical, but killed much of the staff of that magazine.
It was slaughter.
It was one of the ugliest things that religious kind of things that we had seen in the West in recent times, and I think it's disturbing to say, well, that kind of depiction is okay, but the idea, what he's setting up there is all right, well, maybe it's okay in an art history class by, respectful Muslims who, of the time, but it sounded like he was leaving open the idea that maybe we shouldn't study what happened in the Charlie Hebdo massacre. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that. Maybe that's not appropriate for a college classroom because it wasn't that, and I find that very disturbing.
Yeah, because there's absolutely context in an academic environment in which you would show the Charlie Hebdo cartoons to students as part of what you're doing.
How else can you understand why people were upset, even? It's the same here. CNN didn't show this, so you're left, and it was the same with the earlier Mohammed cartoons that were run in Jylland-Posten, in the Danish Mohammed cartoons in the 2000s. It was very difficult to find those, and I remember at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, where I'm a senior fellow, we had a debate over whether it was safe for us to put them on our website because it was very difficult to find. We did, and we said this was just a risk that we needed to take. But it was hard to find those cartoons for a very long time, and Yale actually removed the cartoons from a scholarly book about the debate and the violence over those cartoons. They said that Yale University Press took it right out of the book. So you're reading a book about it, couldn't see them.
A couple of things we need to do before we go to the questions, and I want to just take a minute, and I urge you to be as brief as you can, but because we could spend hours on this. But so the question that I think everyone in the audience is feeling is, okay, we get it. These examples are interesting and telling and in some ways very upsetting. How widespread is this? Is this like the infection that's destroying higher ed, or is this very uneven across higher ed? Is this the future and we better brace for it? So trying to give this the weight that it deserves, knowing it's a grave situation, but is it an existential threat to education? And Robert, you start.
If it is not rolled back, then yes, it is an existential threat.
If there's not a reversal.
If there is not a reversal of this, especially with the power of social media to amplify these things, you're going to see that chilling effect that's already gotten started become more and more crisis, and you will see increasing gaps in education show up, and you're going to see an increasing, as we've already seen, lack of support for higher ed among taxpayers and tuition payers who are wondering what's going on and why they're paying so much money for something that doesn't even sound like you're learning anything. And we're already seeing that. I think that's highly corrosive, so I think it is existential.
And so, James, could you put up chilling effect, because we're sort of there now. So, Keith, what I knew about Princeton in this regard was the long debate about Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of Princeton and later, I'm told, the president of the United States. The question is, should the statue be torn down? Should institutions that are named for him there be renamed? Is it an embarrassment to have Woodrow Wilson associated with the great Princeton University? But I haven't heard many of the sort of incidents like this in classrooms and so on. Surely they exist.
Yeah, no, I think we definitely get various kinds of incidents in classrooms. We haven't had dramatic protest and shout-down incidents at Princeton, but we have had students who have been offended by things they've heard in the classroom and have gone to university administrators wanting to get the professor fired as a consequence of it. We had one just last semester in which that occurred as well. In that case, fortunately, the university, I think, did the right thing and backed the professor and quite quickly. But we definitely have that kind of thing that occurs on the Princeton campus as well. And the other feature of this is that we have lots of faculty who are avoiding topics, just like Professor Gerson described at Harvard Law School in the criminal law classes. I think all across campus you get professors who just think not only of fear, might I get fired if there's a controversial thing that happens in my class, but just is it worth it to have the possibility that I'm going to find myself in the midst of this kind of thing that's just going to be expensive, take up time, be emotionally stressful. It'd just be better to avoid the whole thing, and I just won't talk about that, and we'll talk about something else. Part of the challenge, though, is it's hard to guess as to what the thing will be.
It could be anything, right?
It could be anything. I mean, so I think Josh Blackman's point is a useful one, which is, one, he highlights the fact that he gives talks all over the country all the time. Most of the time they go fine. That's true in all kinds of contexts, so we shouldn't overstate how terrible it is. The universities are not...
He's not Ann Coulter.
Universities are, well, also, but universities are not a post-apocalyptic landscapes.
Right.
It is possible to get education still in universities. It's possible for people like Josh Blackman to give talks. But then suddenly you show up on one campus and suddenly you're surprised by the fact, oh, now I'm being canceled, right? And I don't even know why. Josh probably didn't know why. The students didn't even know why in Josh's case.
Maybe. I think he might be.
Well, some did. I mean, but he said a lot of controversial things, so you don't know what specifically was getting canceled in his particular case. And so I think it has a real consequence for what the teaching looks like. It has some consequences for scholarship. People are unwilling to write and research on certain topics as a consequence of that. And so it has really significant consequences far beyond the set of cases that get a lot of public attention. There is a vast effect throughout universities of all types, whether it's Princeton or state universities of various sorts, as a consequence of seeing these kinds of things happen and people saying, I don't want that to happen to me. How do I avoid it?
So there are lawyers involved. It's expensive.
Yeah.
You could be canceled. Students refuse to take your classes. I've talked to senior professors who are taking early retirement because they just think, no, it's just no longer a joyful thing, and it's certainly not a free marketplace of ideas. And I know professors who say that I watch every sentence that comes out of my mouth. I kind of think through each sentence I'm about to say. And so that chilling effect has to be more important than these flashpoint crises, right?
It is. I mean, the crises sort of highlight it, and I think they do to some extent drive it. But it's the grind of it, just each and every day with every generation or few years when new adjuncts come in and learn what the dangers were, and it just subtracts and subtracts from the college experience until it's very difficult to really justify the kind of expense and time that we expect students to spend in educating themselves.
And I know a fair number of professors who part of their concern is to say, if something happened to me, and even if I thought I was doing the completely right thing, I do not have confidence the university administration would stand behind me. And I know people who are leaving some universities because they think that university administration is not trustworthy. If something happened, it could be disastrous for their career. I'm getting out and going someplace else. And I know people who've left, for example, public universities in California precisely out of a concern to say, the students here are likely to throw fits, and I don't trust the university administration to stand up for academic freedom if push comes to shove, and so I need to go someplace else.
There's some flight to places like Hillsdale and Liberty University and new things that are springing up.
Well, there's certainly that possibility, but even, I mean, fortunately, I think there's sort of more options than just that if you want to do it, but nonetheless, I think you can find yourself at what from the outside would seem like a very prestigious, very serious research university, and yet I know there are faculty that's saying, I don't know if I can continue being at UCLA because something bad might happen, and it's just not worth the trouble. I'll go someplace else where that's less likely to be true. And it doesn't have to be Hillsdale in order to do that, right? There's other options.
Right,
I think they're more mainstream, but at least where you say, I have more confidence in that administration standing up for me. I have more confidence those students are not going to freak out. And so, I think a lot of professors are making some calculations about how they ought to live the rest of their career.
So let's cheer up. We want to show video clip number 5.
A theater in Brooklyn alerted the audience to expect moments of darkness and violence, and this was for Oklahoma. My senior class in high school put on Oklahoma, and I thought it was corny and provincial then. I cannot imagine the fragility of someone who needs to be warned about it. How do these people get to the airport, let alone through childhood? London's Globe Theatre felt the need to tell the audience that its production of Romeo and Juliet includes suicide. Okay, but Romeo and Juliet has been in your Netflix queue since 1596. You've had 400 years to prepare. And also, it does kind of give away the ending. I don't understand how a society that's so in love with spoiler alerts can also be into trigger warnings. Tell me what's going to happen, but don't tell me! And again, all the research shows that these trigger warnings don't even work. What they do is reinforce the idea that trauma is central to your identity and that you should let it define you instead of dealing with it, dispatching it, and moving beyond it. People wonder why the younger generations have so much anxiety. It's this stuff. Lots of stuff makes us uncomfortable. You know what makes me uncomfortable? This bullshit. People...
All right. So Robert, he says that young people are being told that their traumas are critical and that it's in our interest to avoid scratching those traumas. Do you think that's where we are in higher ed?
I think there is that is what's behind the profession of a lot of the concern is that these students will actually legitimately be traumatized. I think that it is important to recognize that the students also understand that claiming to be traumatized is a very powerful place to be, or claiming to be victimized
whether
is
you
very
are
powerful,
or not,
whether or not you are. And so it's difficult to tell how much sincerity is on either side of this. I think people are, universities and actually lots of the organs of our culture, whether or not think they're playing it safe by saying, okay, I think, this person's saying they're traumatized, I'm going to assume that's true. But as Mara pointed out there, this does not stick well with Oklahoma or Romeo and Juliet or any number of other, situations. If you're going to horror movies all the time and then you claim to be traumatized by Romeo and Juliet, there's a good chance you're just trying to get out of the reading.
That does happen.
It does happen. And so the thing is, giving students that amount of power to determine what they're going to be exposed to is a bad idea, because they are supposed to be the ones learning from it. And it is that, we have people like Keith to try to get across the important points of a huge field. And trying to, and letting the students have sort of a get out of jail free button, but sort of an abort button that they can hit, as many times as you want, and that's very emotionally satisfying to hit is a moral hazard that is a lot to ask for a 19-year-old.
So I want to quickly move forward because we're a little behind here, but I want to show slide 31 if I can. So the University of Chicago in 2014 had a long internal debate about this, and you can imagine how volatile that debate was. And they produced a manifesto, a kind of a platform, which they promulgated for themselves. It's now been adopted by, I think, over 80 institutions in the United States, so it has been extremely influential, and I think on the whole very positive. Just look at one slide. This is the manifesto from the University of Chicago. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict, of course, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. You know, in my opinion, Keith, it doesn't get any better than that. That's perfectly stated, I think.
No, I think it's a great statement. Princeton was one of the first institutions to adopt that statement as well. I was among those who was trying to get that to happen. In our case, we did it through a vote of the faculty and wound up embedding it into the policies of the university, so they're enforceable. But I think it's a great statement. It's primarily written by Jeff Stone, who's a First Amendment scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. And I think he did a great job in laying out some very basic fundamentals that I would have hoped would demand sort of consensus support. What's partially striking about this, though, is there's been a lot of controversy around this document. A lot of campuses have refused to adopt it. A lot of faculty refused to adopt it. A lot of students in Chicago complain that they've adopted it and want it repealed. So the thing that I find very depressing about this is it's only 80 schools that signed on to this idea. And that there are many schools where there were people who thought maybe we should do it too, and they didn't.
Not yet, maybe.
Not yet, maybe.
80's not nothing.
80's not nothing.
And, and some of them are very distinguished universities, like Princeton.
Yeah, sure, that's right. But it's, but I am genuinely distressed by the fact that I know people at other institutions who tried to persuade their own faculty to adopt that statement, and their faculty refused. Yeah, and it helped in our case that we did it very early. So as soon as this was written, I immediately started trying to get Princeton to do it because I thought it was important.
So you helped to lead the charge there.
No, absolutely. And moreover, I thought that it was important to for this to be a national statement. I thought we all ought to be signing on. Universities across the country ought to be signing on to this in order to say broadly to the public, these are essential values to universities and how they operate. And so I was not very concerned about Princeton per se. I was concerned to say we ought to be sending this out as a message about what universities are all about. But we were very fortunate in some ways. I think that we adopted it very early, so when faculty questioned whether or not we should adopt it, it was relatively easy for me to say, I don't think there are problems here at Princeton. This is about a national debate and controversy. I think if I were to try to get Princeton to adopt this now, I probably couldn't get it adopted. Precisely because there'd be faculty who say, oh, well, now I've got a set of ideas I'm concerned about, and this is now controversial, and I don't want to do it.
They've been enabled by the controversy elsewhere.
They're enabled by controversies elsewhere. They think about their own campus responsibilities. We had a whole bunch of faculty sign a letter a couple of years ago urging the university to create a faculty committee that could fire tenured faculty if they produced research or engaged in teaching that the members of that committee thought were racist. And given what counts as racist potentially, that's just like a massive hole within academic freedom policies. So I'm not confident that even the universities that have already signed on to this would be willing to sign it again today.
All right, so I want to just close, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions with just two clips, not three. We'll start with, so backlash is our theme here. And the backlash has come partly from within, as you just said, but it's also, as you all know, coming from without, from the political arena. And of course, here's the number one statement of that.
We can't just stand idly by while woke ideology ravages every institution in our society. We must fight the woke in our schools. We must fight the woke in our businesses. We must fight the woke in government agencies. We can never, ever surrender to woke ideology. And I'll tell you this, the state of Florida is where woke goes to die.
To just stop there. So, I mean, I don't know who he's channeling, but it sounds like he's channeling his inner Churchill. We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them in the landing
never
grounds. We
surrender.
shall fight them in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills, and we shall never surrender. He's clearly echoing a little of that sort of extremist, well, not extremist, but heavily rhetorical language, let's say, whether you agree with his basic point or not. So I found that, and of course he's regarding this as his pathway into the presidency of the United States, and it might be true, because there is a widespread, I think, non-political uneasiness with what people regard as the extremists in the woke movement. And I think many people here feel that. I feel that. I think we all feel it at times. And I think he understands that this is a path where independents and some Democrats will join him because of concern for their children and so on.
I promise I'll make it fast, but I can tell you we did market research on this. Like, we hired a big New York ad agency to do market research on wokeness and that sort of thing. We ran focus groups, we ran polls, we did focus groups that were mixed race, men only, women only. We could not get a group, any demographic group, to have a majority of people who didn't say they hated this. They hated wokeness.
The majority in all your
The
groups?
majority in every African Americans, women, white people, Asians. Like, people hate what DeSantis is kind of describing there, and of course the definition of it. But like, it has the worst marketing ever. Like,
This is not working, you're saying?
No, I'm saying you should be very worried about DeSantis, because he is on to something.
He's on to
big
something,
time.
right, exactly.
Big time, like way bigger than we thought.
Yeah, I think so too. I think he's shrewd about that, and I think
Yeah.
that he understands that we're all a little uneasy in certain ways about this. All right, so one last one, and then Chris, are you going to be? You're going to be the Q&A guy, so he'll bring the microphone around. Please be as brief as you can. But here's one. This is my friend Marzio Mian from Milan. He's an Italian journalist who's been in 58 countries. He's award-winning, and he, for the past year in our Zoom conversations, he's been saying that the problem is not just America, it's now flipped across the Atlantic Ocean and is poisoning Europeans. And of course, he says it in a typically Italian way, and we have subtitles so you can see it.
This is really a dramatic sign of Western decadence, I think. And if the 20th century was the American century, the pinnacle of Western spirit, I suspect that this is the century where America, in some ways, humiliates Western culture. I mean, in Europe, we are people like me who love American culture and knows about it, and we are really very angry. Especially those who love America are angry. The cancel culture and the woke culture represent a form of, I think, a form of dictatorship, reminiscent of that of the communist bloc. But this is the death of the West. It is really ironical, because in some way we see the West posing against Russia, against Putin, as and defending the reasons to the basic principles of the West: democracy, free thought, and so on, against the autocracy. But in the same time, the West is in the middle of a suicide.
Okay then. Very strong. And we had a long and wonderful interview. All these interviews we conducted specifically for this series here, and that's one of the things that Zoom has brought to us, that people that we would like to hear from, some of whom come, and we're so thankful that you did, others who for whatever reason can't, and they've been very generous with their time, and we've learned about this subject by listening. And so that's really our theme: to elucidate, to illuminate, to provide insights if possible, and to help you carry away from evenings like this a better understanding of what's at stake, how widespread it is, how dangerous it might be, etc. So now let's do Q&A. So Chris.
Great. Just a couple of quick notes. Raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone. Don't turn anything on. Don't turn anything off. Speak into it like this. If you do that, I can't hear you. If you do that, I can't hear you. Please stand up if you can. I'm going to limit you to one question. People sometimes say, I have 3 questions. If we have time, we'll come back to you. 1 question a person. Hopefully we'll get to all of them. I also encourage you to be brief in your responses. And so let's go. Who's got the first question?
Here's one back there in the 17th row. We got 25 minutes.
Pete, thanks for being the first. It always takes one.
How did it all start? We have these left-wing professors. How did it all start? We have these largely left-wing professors who have been outflanked on the left by the kids. What happened?
So how did this happen? How did this come about?
It's not clear to me, actually, how it came about. I mean, I think it's that a lot of the ideas that are driving this did develop initially, I think, and were promulgated by left-wing professors of various sorts. I mean, this is sort of a plague that has escaped from the lab of certain humanities departments. But it is striking the extent to which students, I think, arrive on college campuses already pretty convinced of these things. And so I think it's penetrated very deeply into particularly secondary education, which is partially through ed schools that then train teachers on this front, and they're carrying it into some degree primary education, but especially secondary education, so students are getting it pretty early and they arrive on campus with it already. And it's also spread through the internet and social media. So a lot of students have really been basting in this kind of set of ideas through their own internet consumption that they're doing on their own time. And so by the time they get to college, a lot of this stuff is pretty much baked in.
So it's not that they're coming as neutral to college and then being proselytized. That happens too, but you're saying...
It happens too, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concern that universities are indoctrinating students in various ways. There's just not much evidence for that. And I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing on this front is not something that is a function of students arrive and we create it, but it's instead a function of students arrive with this already in their head.
Question here.
I've heard many definitions of woke. Could each of you define woke, including you, Clay?
So he's asked us, if you didn't quite hear that, to define woke in the shortest possible compass. Robert, you start.
I think if you are sufficiently, I think being woke means that you have your finger on the pulse of the most recent social media driven ideologies on controversial cultural issues.
Well done.
How about that? All right.
Well, I mean, I think the narrow definition where it initially develops is really which overlaps almost completely with critical race theory. It's a belief that there's systematic discrimination on the basis of various characteristics that permeates contemporary society. I think it's spread to include a lot of other stuff. It's constantly evolving as to what those who are running under it would also think is incorporated, not to mention the critics, of course. But that's, I think, the core where it began.
I'm going to be more generous than the two of you. I think there's woke and there's woke.
Yeah.
I think woke means wake up. There's a kind of a Eurocentric, white male, privileged way of looking at the history of culture, and if you wake up, you realize it's not quite true, that there's been a lot of oppression, that race has been one of the central issues of American life, and that has been examined in the course of our historiography and our teaching, and that you need to wake up and realize that it's a lot more complex than you thought, and it's not as pretty as you thought. And that's, I think, why people like Ron DeSantis are so freaked out about it, because whether you agree with it or not, it reveals a set of complications about American life and the life of the planet that don't cheer us up very much and tell us that we have been living in kind of a world of illusion to a certain degree. And I think that's good. And on the whole, I think wokeness has opened our minds. It certainly opened mine. I see Thomas Jefferson in a way that I did not see him in 1985, in a way I did not see him in 1995. And I think that's on the whole good. But I just wrote this afternoon, not knowing that this question would come. And I think and I hope you two will agree, but I think we need to defend our institutions and our vocations without being defensive, which is part of this too. We need to concede that which is indefensible. We need to concede certain things that just are palpably true. And that doesn't mean that it's all about racism, but you can no longer look at Thomas Jefferson without race being at or near the center of any discourse. And so we need to concede that. We shouldn't be defensive about it. And then we need to criticize without being righteous. And that's the hard one, to criticize without being righteous. And I think on the whole, our culture is better for it than not, but I think obviously it runs to extremes and moments of craziness. And there's a kind of a viral nature of it thanks to social media and so on. But I don't want to condemn it out of hand. And I would ask each one of you to say one sentence that's positive about wokeness.
To the extent that it helps you examine the unexamined assumptions you've made, it fits in well with the Enlightenment
The very
project.
idea of the university, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to the idea that there's systemic discrimination of various sorts, and it's important to identify and uncover those kind of structures. And I think that at the core of the movement was a desire to call attention to that, and I think that was appropriate.
And to do that doesn't mean you hate America, or that you're apologizing for America, or that you are a leftist, or that you are, a radical of some sort. So I think what we really hope is that these kind of discussions kind of ground us all. And I appreciate your asking the question.
So obviously this is a multifaceted problem that's been going on for decades. But how much of this could be laid at the feet of the funding model of universities and the federalization of loans, giving the universities a tremendous amount of capital with which to found these bureaucracies that now have become metastases?
Is the funding model part of the problem?
Yes, it definitely is. I mean, there's a gusher of cash into universities, and they have not had to set forth priorities in the way that most businesses that aren't Google or Amazon have to, make the hard choices. And the number of bureaucrats that are on campuses is stunning. I was saying, it was like a sighting when you would see a dean or the president of the university. I think I saw Duke's president once at the beginning and once at the end of my entire time. Now you cannot, I am telling you, you cannot go onto these campuses without tripping over any number of bureaucrats. I can't tell you how many cases came to fire where the problem was literally you said something and an administrator overheard it. Like they did not exist. I mean, this number of them just were not present 20 years ago. And the iron law of bureaucracy is that the bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy, right? I mean, that's how it goes. And that has definitely happened, and they are looking for a problem to solve, and they're going to find it.
Other questions here? Yes.
I have about 20 questions, but I know. It's sort of the cliche now that universities have diversity of everything but thought. How are they preparing these kids to deal with controversy? They can't read Huckleberry Finn. They can't listen to Ben Shapiro or these guys you've mentioned. They're triggered and they need a safe space. When they get in the real world, not everybody's going to agree with them. They're going to have very disagreeable bosses who think the opposite of the way they think. But are we really preparing them to deal with that when we're coddling them and protecting them from anything that might disturb them in the classroom?
Yeah, so that statement you made, diversity in everything but thought, are we disserving our students by not preparing them for the real business of the hugger-mugger of life?
Well, I think we're certainly doing a disservice to students, and we're not accomplishing part of what we ought to be accomplishing, which is certainly to get students to think more critically, to be able to think through a wide range of ideas, to be exposed to a wide range of ideas. One of the things I find very disturbing about sort of where we're headed as universities is for a lot of people, there's a real view that the degree of discussion and viewpoints that ought to be represented on university campus is not as broad as you'd find in a public library or on cable TV. And that's not the way universities ought to operate. On the other hand, I think there's concern of saying, well, what happens when the students get out and they're in the real world? I think for a while, a lot of us thought, this will be the check that will help push back on this. But instead, it turns out all those students get out and they continue to behave the same way in the real world. And they demand that the real world accommodate themselves to this kind of perspective and behave more like college campuses. And in a lot of institutions, that's true. And so I think it's having damaging effects to society more generally because I think these students are actually making a lot of headway in reshaping how we're thinking as a society and culture more generally.
I'll add that John Haidt is writing about, he's sort of writing about the reverse cognitive behavioral therapy kind of thing that's happening. And I think while they are reshaping the world, people are accommodating them, employers are accommodating them, the organs of our culture are accommodating them, the huge increase in depression that we're seeing and attitude sorts of things, I think are the inevitable outcome of that sort of constant catastrophizing, this constant like wheel of the next thing is bad, the next thing is bad, the next thing is bad that we've trained students to do. So even if they're turning the world that way, they're not benefiting from it, and neither is anybody else. So they're not. It's not necessarily making the world better, even in the process of them trying to do that.
Yeah, no, we genuinely have students on college campuses now who think that racial relations are worse right now than they were in 1930, right? I mean, it's just insane as an empirical, factual matter, and yet that's what they're convinced of. And it's not surprising then, if that's what they think is true, that it has horrible effects on their own mental health, but also have terrible effects on how they behave more generally. And so it's a very strange situation we find ourselves backing into, and I think it'll be very hard to unwind it.
So you mentioned coddling and you mentioned Haidt, so let's have a little Jonathan Haidt.
Do you think peanut allergies tell us about the state of American culture today?
In the United States, as in a number of countries, peanut allergies have been rising. And the mystery as to why they're rising is kind of I'd almost say a metaphor for the whole book, but it's actually a homology, meaning it's the same process. What I mean by that is the rate of peanut allergies is only rising in countries that recommend that pregnant women avoid peanuts and avoid giving their kids peanuts. And so when my son was starting preschool, and at the age of 3, we got a long lecture on all the peanut products and things that had been near peanuts and things that looked like peanuts and anything with a P in it we weren't supposed to bring to school. And later on, as I looked into it, what I discovered is that there was recently a study showing that if they recruited 600 women who'd recently given birth, whose kids were at risk of peanut allergy. Half were given the standard advice to avoid peanuts, keep them away from your kid. Half were told, here's some kind of a snack that is a corn puff with peanut dust on it. Give it to your kid. And at the age of 5, it turned out that the kids who followed standard advice, 14% of them had a peanut allergy. So for the rest of their lives, they're going to have to be careful. And in the half that were given peanuts, 2% had a peanut allergy. The point is, when we're protecting kids, we're protecting them from things that they actually need to get stronger. The immune system needs to be exposed to all kinds of things in order to learn. In the same way, kids need to be exposed. They need to fall down in order to get a sense of balance. They need to be teased and excluded in order to learn how to navigate the social world. They need to take risks on the playground in order to know how to face physical risks when they're older. We've been depriving kids of these things, and this, we think, is one of the major reasons why rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicide are way up among American youth.
That seems a little overstated there, but you take his point.
I don't really think it is overstated. No, I think it's put appropriately because we are. I mean, I am one of those parents who had to avoid every kind of nut. Thankfully, my kids avoided allergies, probably because we're filthy or whatever, So thankfully, I've been able to avoid that. But it is not a mercy to try to spare people things and then result. I mean, if we've given 12% more people depression, out of this. I think we need to take a very serious look at whether or not that is worth the perceived improvements that we're making, especially given that, it's not a specific, people can't choose. All right, this isn't the sort of thing where people can necessarily choose to be affected by it. It's this sort of societal experiment we're running, and it's coming up with a lot of very bad results.
Fair enough. You got a couple more.
I have a quick follow-up. So Keith, you talked about the fact that it's not leaving. They're getting this in college. They're taking it into the workplace. So is the pendulum not going to swing back, which is what we're used to happening in society?
I think there will be some reversal of some features of this, but I think it's definitely going to affect us for the long term, right? I don't think all this is going to get reversed. So just thinking even about trigger warnings, for example, which was a very hot topic a few years ago, I think that wave is crested. I think people are starting to back away from doing trigger warnings as much, and there's not the same kind of proposals that there were at one point to adopt them. So I think we do see retreat on some of these features. But there's going to be a lot that's going to remain for a long time, I think.
And they're also here to stay. I mean, there will be trigger warnings in a way that there weren't 20 years ago.
That's true, too.
Going forward, whether or not they're actually helpful.
Yeah, as we saw in that art history class at Hamlin, right? I mean, in that case, the instructor voluntarily was doing the trigger warnings, and I think a fair number of faculty sort of have embraced that.
And there's some concern that trigger warnings may actually trigger trauma rather than warn people to be careful about it so that they actually have a reverse effect.
There's evidence that it triggers trauma. There's also evidence, for example, that if you give trigger warnings, students will not read material that has trigger warnings associated with it. So if you tell them that that you should be cautious about Romeo and Juliet, not only will some of them say, yeah, I don't have to read it, but some of them will just avoid reading it because they're so fearful of encountering it. And then professors will also think, well, I have to put a trigger warning on it. I shouldn't include it in the class at all. So I should just take it off. And part of what's disturbing with the Hamlin situation as well was it became evidence against the instructor that she gave a trigger warning. She
knew better. She should have known better.
She should have known. No, that's exactly right. And so the claim was now the thing we told you should be doing, because she did it, it shows her guilty conscience. And so that further condemns it.
So we have 10 more minutes. Go ahead, sir.
As a young conservative professor at a major university, what are the chances of getting tenured these days?
Depends on the university and depends how smart you are about shutting up.
I mean, truly, you mean that.
And I do mean that, and it's frankly good advice to give to people. I think I should say, though, that that's not true just for conservative professors, but for I think we are seeing this effect on adjuncts and young professors of all stripes, because there is a very narrow kind of Overton window, or there can be, within the faculties who vote on things. And there's already so much academic politics, and then adding the actual politics in there. If you are a little bit too far to the left for the current incumbents in that area, that can be just as deadly. I think, if anything, conservatives probably have a little bit more warning going in, and they understand that they probably just need to cool it for 7 or 8 years in a way that people who are on the left, or have, more left, however you construe that ideas, I think it sandbags them a little bit more. So I think it's bad for everybody.
I was once a young right-wing professor concerned about whether or not I'd get tenure. Or even get a job. And I was fortunate, I made it through, but I didn't get some jobs, I know, because of politics. I've had difficulty publishing stuff, I know, because of politics. It affected tenure decisions in general. So it is a feature of university life, and I learned very quickly in grad school that I need to be very cautious and careful about what I said and how I said it, and the kinds of things I did, and I didn't completely shy away from it. I also didn't lean into my politics more generally. And I was far more concerned about that issue early in my career than I was this kind of academic freedom stuff in general, because that was the far more pressing, immediate concern from my perspective.
Here.
We're going to hear a question from a more recent college graduate.
2 years, yeah. This question is kind of specifically geared towards Keith because it deals with something that he said earlier. You noted that social justice is an end, but that it's an end that blocks the search for truth or something of that nature. Can you elaborate a bit on what end social justice accomplishes on its own, and I guess in what specific respects you feel it ends up blocking our search for unbiased thought?
Yeah, so the social justice, I think it's somewhat amorphous, right? People mean different things by it in general, so it's like woke in that sense, right? It's very hard to actually pin down. And it's often, if you're going to talk about it, winds up being useful to just say, okay, specifically what do you have in mind? Let's break it down rather than sort of talk about the term itself. But a lot of the stuff that comes with that term is now being put as these set the boundaries of what acceptable research and teaching should look like. And so we've seen that, for example, it is true at this point that there are, just in the last couple of years, some natural science journals that have said part of our review criteria on whether or not we will publish work is whether or not we think the implications of the scientific article you've written may have bad outcomes in society and in politics at large. The racism committee that I indicated that the Princeton faculty wanted to adopt, driven by that same concern, that there's some kinds of things you shouldn't be researching, you shouldn't be teaching. There's reports which we're still investigating as to whether or not they're totally true, but there are reports that there are governmental funding sources for scientific research that has put barriers on certain kinds of research topics or off limits. Because it potentially leads to bad outcomes. Institutional review boards on college campuses, which is the internal body that you have to get approval from in order to conduct certain scientific studies involving human subjects in general. Institutional review boards are increasingly adopting as part of their standard concerns about what are the normative implications of the research you're doing, what kind of politics might this affect, and what kind of public policies might this affect down the road, and refusing then to authorize faculty to engage in that research because of those long-term implications. So it's spread across a wide range of sort of particular places where it's putting genuine hard boundaries. And that is a very, very recent development, right? I mean, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, is this concerning because people are talking as if this might be true, but it wasn't happening yet. In the last 2 or 3 years, totally happening.
And it's like hobbling yourself when you're trying to get there, because if you are not able to figure out the actual state of society or the state of the science or whatever it is, you're not, I mean, you've got, it's like thinking the moon is made of cheese and then like planning your entire moon mission surrounding that when you have to believe that. You can't get to a socially just society if you've purposely hobbled your ability to understand the current state of society and the realities around it.
Yeah, and I should just add on this note as well, right? I mean, so I think that's happening on university campuses. We're seeing these kinds of constraints being built in to research and teaching across a lot of dimensions. But some of these Republican-leaning state legislative proposals, such as what is being adopted in Florida, but also other places, are doing the exact same thing, just from a different angle, right? But they impose the exact same kind of limits, and particularly on classroom teaching, but I wouldn't be surprised if it eventually expands off into research as well.
I think this is very valuable. You know, when we started, this is our 4th in the series, and when we started, we were sort of adopting a crossfire approach, you know, debate, he said, you know, sort of a built-in antagonism, and we thought, well, of course that's interesting and sometimes entertaining, but I think you'll all agree, we get plenty of that in American life. So we decided to change our approach a little bit and move towards more of an elucidation model, a clarification model. And I hope you feel that you come away from tonight with a better understanding of this phenomenon than you came in, and that what you heard was fair and thoughtful and reasoned. And although we didn't all agree, and I'm sure we don't all agree with all of you, that there was an integrity to the discourse. And I think that's what we're really seeking here, and we're going to be doing more of these, and I hope you will come to all of them. We also have added these clips, which is quite a bit of work, actually. We draw a few from YouTube and so on, but mostly we interview people, and I want to thank Christine Moore for the really important role you've played in helping get that done and clarify our sort of way of thinking about this. But I think the clips are useful. We want to know if you think that they're useful and if they help move it along and keep it entertaining and break up some of the discourse a little bit. I think that we're all a little weary in the last 10 years, especially the last 5 or 6 years of the debate of the national ad hominem polarization debate. And so we don't want to encourage that. We want to move in a slightly different direction of really providing you value added, and we're able to talk eminent people coming a long, long way from North Carolina and from New Jersey to spend time with you. And I think that that's really outstanding. So I just want to thank Robert Shibley of FIRE and Keith Whittington, the Wilson Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton. Cromwell, was he the Cromwell of the Panama Canal, Cromwell? I think so.
Maybe. I mean, he was a Gilded Age
and
robber baron lawyer. So.
He helped Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, decide to build the Panama Canal.
Yeah, that's probably right.
That's true. Anyway, let's give them a round of applause.